It's only in the United States that you can claim to be a dissident when you're in fact actually trying to maximize your profitability within the system. That's only in the United States. Go ahead.
Say again.
So it's only in the United States that you can pretend to be a dissident while simultaneously trying to maximize your life goals. You're not a dissident then. Just I don't want to hear it. But you did have a question that was answered in the chat, so I feel like it's worth reading. CC Littleja writes, the majority of libertarians do not agree with the Lockean proviso, and they are hardcore proprietarians. So for those who don't know what the Lockean proviso is, it's the idea basically that you can't kick out the ladder from the guy that comes after you. So Locke says you can homestead property, but you can't homestead so much of it that there's none left for the next guy. And so it's sort of it's an ends and means thing, because the means you use can't be those means that would exclude other people from homesteading. So for example, if you homestead a property across a river right at the point of the bridge and then hired a bunch of guys to defend that bridge and said, hey, you can't get over, well, that would be violating the Lockean proviso, because nobody can get across the river to homestead the rest of the property. You just homesteaded that right at the edge of the bridge, right? And so that's important.
I think Ayn Rand solved that problem by just declaring all her turbo capitalists as heroes that she would basically not take the ladder away, but nobody else would ever be able to get up to the level of her heroes. At least if you look at Atlas Shrugged, that's kind of like an interesting solution of that dilemma, but it's not a realistic one, right? So
Yeah.
Then it sounds like more like you're libertarian, then you basically are in favor of first mover has the advantage of basically expanding into a corporation.
Yeah. Now, the other thing, this ties in, I think, to a point Keith made, where libertarians are just, well, and many of them are ignorant, possibly even willfully so, of the role the state has in the corporation. But back to what I was saying about 15 minutes ago, they on paper admitted this, right? Rothbard admitted this. Rothbard quoted Gabriel Coco multiple times. Radical libertarians in the early 2000s would say this, but then they wouldn't really act on it. And I think this is why they failed to defeat the military-industrial complex, because they don't understand. This is just a part of the economy. It's just the market. So about a decade ago now, I think, I had a debate with Bob Murphy on the Tom Woods Show. And one of the things that I pointed out is that with the private production of defense, so I had a twofold argument. One, that you actually couldn't do it. But then there was a second follow-up argument where any sort of corporation that could provide such a service would be incentivized to do two things. It would be incentivized to stimulate wars, because how else is it going to sell its products? If there aren't wars, that's why that's why in 1934 Engelbrecht wrote about the merchants of death. I mean, if no one's going to buy your guns or bullets or shells, what are you doing, right? You're not doing anything. And then second of all, they don't want to suffer property damage. So they're going to do preemptive strikes, so the other guy has to endure the property damage. And so the point is, the military-industrial complex is for-profit war, right? See, this is what people just fail to understand. This is why the modern world is so insane, right? It's the Romans and the Chinese never armed the Huns. They're not like, oh, hey, let's stimulate a war right now and arm the horde and see what happens. Never happened. But corporations funded the USSR, built its factories, helped to militarize, and Brzezinski in the Technotronic Age accepts the findings of Sutton's research. So again, and then also Ronald Reagan's foreign policy advisor on the Soviet Union also accepted that as well. So this is just a fact, right? The fact that the academy, see, because here's the thing, the people who make decisions during the Cold War accepted Sutton's findings, right? Whereas the academy is just political correctness. So of course they're going to ignore that. The point is, they have a built-in interest to fund wars, to stimulate wars, so they can have product to sell. And that's just the market. That's just the economy. So, but the libertarians have this weird idea that armaments, especially if it's a for-profit corporation providing defense, you need to have, you're going to have the stimulated war effort. And it's like, okay, well, we'll answer that. Well, they can't. Bob Murphy couldn't. Now, granted, Tom Woods is the host, so I don't expect him to weigh in on that directly. But after the fact, he didn't really do that. So the point then becomes when we look at the wars, that the military industrial complex is behind, there's a mindset behind it that, and this is something that in Engelbrecht's work, Harry Elmer Barnes writes the foreword, and he says, look, I mean, most of these people are not like, some Dracula villain with like blood dripping from their fangs. They're just trying to make money like everybody else. But in this case, making money is war. So the idea then is, well, why would they have a different logical calculus? Well, they wouldn't. And I think that is really where the libertarian movement just shipwrecked. So that's where they shipwrecked. The idea is that they couldn't understand the fact that for-profit wars are built into the production of defense within a market economy like we have today. And the Romans didn't do this. They didn't create weapons and then sell them to the Huns. The Chinese didn't create weapons and sell them to the Mongols. This is stupid. Why would you do that? They're going to invade you and take over. And I think that philosophical, as you said, they're very philosophical, Keith. The philosophical error is what did them in.
Yeah, well, to clarify some of the things I was saying earlier about property rights, one problem with the Lockean proviso is that it's an illustration of what I was talking about, of the libertarian concept of property rights being stuck in time. When Locke developed his theory of property rights, he was living in early modern England, and his idea of property rights is, okay, individual freeholders, small farmers, should be able to farm crops on their own land and keep their crops and not have to turn them over to the feudal lords or sell them or trade them to other farmers if they want. Or merchants, this was when early modern capitalism was starting to develop. Merchants should be able to buy and sell things, or craftspeople should be able to buy and sell things. Like if one person makes shoes and the other person makes saddlebags, you should be able to make those and trade them. And the Lockean model of property rights makes sense in that context. But trying to apply the Lockean idea of property rights to the 21st century is crazy. The idea that Facebook and Amazon and General Motors and Goldman Sachs are just out there doing their Lockean free trade bit, is absurdity. And I think that this is a major flaw in modern libertarian theory. In addition to the class bias, I don't think we can take out the class bias, because over and over again, I've heard libertarians make comments where it's clear that what they really believe is that libertarianism or free market economics, or whatever they want to call it, free market conservatism, should just be about advancing certain lifestyle interests or certain class interests. For instance, some years ago, probably at least 20 years, maybe longer, I heard Ken Hamblin, who used to be a popular radio host, who I think identified as a libertarian or conservative-leaning libertarian or something. I heard him debate a woman from the Democratic Socialists of America, and he was lambasting welfare. And then she said, well, meaning social welfare, like, poor people on food stamps or whatever. And the DSA woman said, well, what about all the other types of warfare? What about corporate welfare? And he was actually trying to make a defense of corporate welfare and say, oh, no, that facilitates economic growth and development. That's all good, And then I remember seeing a lecture in person once from Mark. It was a debate. It was a debate between Mark Skozin, who's a well-known libertarian economist, and Larkin Rose, who's sort of a way out on the edge anarcho-capitalist. And Mark Skozin was actually making a defense of eminent domain, basically saying, well, eminent domain is good because it helps, efficiency as far as like constructing highway systems to facilitate trade. In other words, he's not really interested in abolishing the state. He just thinks the state should exist to promote certain economic values and related lifestyle interests. And Mitt Romney, now I don't think he identifies as a libertarian. He's just more of a standard Reagan type conservative. But I know when he was running for president, during his campaign, at one point he was lambasting people, like poor people who are unproductive and that kind of stuff. There was that quote about, well, you've got the top 50% productive people, and then you've got all the slothful people on the bottom 50%. During that same campaign, when he made a stop in Houston, he was lambasting Houston for not having zoning laws. Okay, well, a lot of libertarians will criticize zoning, saying it inflates the cost of housing, it prevents business development, stuff like that. Right? Maybe a case can or can't be made for that, but it's clear that Romney was not a consistent free market economist. He thought that the purpose of free market economics should only be to advance the class interest of people at his class position. So I think that, and I come across this kind of stuff all the time in libertarian circles. That's just a few examples. And as far as the libertarianism that emerged during the Ron Paul era, I think the issue there is that when Ron Paul came along and was sort of a fringe presidential candidate, but a popular enough one that he developed an audience and a fan base, I don't think that means that a whole lot of people became converts to libertarianism. It just meant, well, there were people who heard Ron Paul saying he was against the Federal Reserve, which some people were blaming on the economic downturn of 2008. Or he was saying he was against the wars, which by that point had already been going on for years with no end in sight. So I think a lot of people were receptive to that message, but a lot of people who got involved with Ron Paul and his movement were novices in politics. And a lot of them eventually went over into all kinds of things. Like I knew people who were in the Ron Paul movement who eventually went over into the hardcore alt-right or even became fascists. I knew people who were Ron Paul fans who eventually became communists. Most people probably didn't go to that extreme, but the Ron Paul movement eventually just branched out into all kinds of things. And that leads to what I think is another major flaw in libertarianism. And that is libertarianism has not been able to distinguish itself or create an identity for itself beyond this wider mainstream American culture war. What I have seen is that all the libertarian factions have largely just become appendages to various culture war factions. Like before, I was mentioning different libertarian factions, the liberalitarians and minarchists and anarcho-capitalists and market anarchists and neocon libertarians and all that kind of stuff. And what I've seen is that all these different libertarian currents, even though they're very small subcultures, they've largely just attached themselves to different culture war factions, meaning that they don't really have an individual identity as a distinct movement. They're just sort of attached to whatever wider cultural tribe or metapolitical tribe they most identify with. For instance, you can go to the Center for a Stateless Society website, and you can have people, you can find articles by people saying why libertarians should vote for the Democrats. And you can find stuff similar to that, only it's for the Republicans, say, probably in the Mises Institute archives or Cato Institute archives, or certainly somewhere like the Ayn Rand Institute. So there's no independent identity there. Libertarians don't have an independent identity apart from the wider culture war. Instead, they just sort of fragment into, align themselves with whatever culture war tribe or whatever ruling class faction they find least objectionable. And if you look at successful movements or influential movements from the past, that's not what they did. For instance, if you look at old school communists, for them, communism was their identity. If Democrats or Republicans or somebody like that did something that advanced communism in their mind, look, great, good for them. Doesn't mean they're going to become one. Around the world, the Islamists, the Islamists don't just align themselves with whatever ruling class faction they like the most. They might take weapons from the CIA or something when it's convenient, but they have their own identity. We are for the caliphate. But libertarians, I think, don't really have an independent identity of that type, and that keeps them from being a genuinely influential movement.
Sounds like you just said libertarians are the arch conservatives, Keith.
I said what?
It sounds like you just said libertarians are the arch conservatives.
In what way?
Well, in the sense that all they do is they don't rock the boat. They just preserve the status quo. They just try to make, as much money as they can preserving the status quo.
Well, if you define conservatism as that, yeah, if you define conservatism as somebody that just wants to preserve what is and